Well, good evening. Thank you for joining me tonight for Bible study. As we've a couple of weeks before Ash Wednesday, we talked a little bit about some tools and some mindsets that I think are important to reading the Bible to sort of get us away from that very simplistic, literalistic way of reading the Bible that just constantly seems to get us in the wrong place. To being a little bit more open, to bringing in all of the tools we have available to us. And so if you haven't had a chance yet, if you ever get a chance, those 4 studies are posted on the St. Matthew website. And I think if you scroll back even down through the Facebook page, you can find them there as well. But what I want to do now for the next couple of weeks is just show you how we can do that and how we can take some texts and bring in all of this conversation and get a little wider view of them kind of as well. So I'm going to start tonight, and I'm going to kind of work in sections through the scriptures as we go. But I want to start tonight with a text from the Pentateuch, which we might have also called the Torah. It's the first 5 books of the Bible, right? It's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We call it the Pentateuch because Penta, of course, a prefix that means 5. I prefer that word, the Pentateuch, because the word Torah really belongs to a different tradition. And again, I think part of always as we're reading what we call the Old Testament, what might be more better referred to for us as the Hebrew Bible, we do that with some sensitivity, some thoughtfulness to remember that this is also a book that belongs to another tradition as well. And we're not trying to tell them how to read their Bible in the way that we read ours. We acknowledge sort of the set notions that we bring in with us as we go into these texts. But anyway, I want to talk a little bit about text in the Pentateuch. Now, in the Pentateuch, you find primary two kinds of writings. One is historical, and there are narratives. There are stories about the patriarchal fathers, about Abraham and Jacob and Isaac and Joseph. There are stories about the creation. There are these prehistorical stories, and of course there are the stories about the Exodus, about the freedom from slavery, that being such an important theme in the Bible. But then there is all this other material that is really this assortment of this compilation of laws. In fact, in the Pentateuch, there are 631 unique laws, demands, commandments. We can use instructions. You can use a variety of words to describe them. And that makes up quite a bulk then of these 5 books, particularly in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy, a little bit in Numbers as well, and of course the end of Exodus as well. And those become really interesting materials for interpretation. And so what I really want to do tonight is I want to pick a particular text out of Leviticus to help us think about how do we interpret, how do we understand, how do we use those texts. Because it's certainly been my experience as a pastor, and I'm going to guess you've had that same experience as well, that those are the ones that really get us tied in knots as a community of faith. But I think we have a better way to do that. And that's what I want to suggest to you tonight. So I'm going to take this text from the book of Leviticus. I'm guessing it's fairly well known, if not necessarily well understood. This is the beginning of the 11th chapter. And it says, "From among all the land animals, these are the creatures you may eat. Any animal that has divided hoofs and is cleft-footed and chews the cud, such you may eat. But among those that chew the cud and have divided hoofs, you shall not eat the following." And then it goes into a long list of all the different animals, specific list, really kind of a fascinating list, actually. And then when it gets done with the land animals, then we get the sea animals, and we get the birds, and we get the insects. This is part of that section of Leviticus, and we also would find the same sort of conversation in Deuteronomy as well, about what we would call, as Christians, what we would tend to refer to as keeping kosher, right? These rules about what you may eat and what you may not eat, and they're part of a larger code. And I want us to get into that question of that larger code because I want us to understand what these restrictions mean, and that these restrictions are meaningless outside of that larger context of the Levitical code, of all of the laws and commandments in those first 5 books of the Bible. This part of Leviticus stands in a particular place in the Pentateuch. The book of Exodus begins, of course, with the freeing of the slaves. You know the Charlton Heston movie, The 10 Commandments, the plagues, the passage through the sea, all of that, and they come finally to Mount Sinai, and Moses gives them the commandments, and you get what we would consider the 10 Commandments. One of those fascinating things, by the way, when you open your Bible, you'll see a little subheading on that particular place in Exodus chapter 20 that says the 10 Commandments. Some editor put that in there. That's not in the original scrolls. Those are just the 10 Commandments because they come first. Although I think we would all agree that they have a particular sort of breadth to them that they seem inclusive. But this notion that somehow those are the 10 primary commandments and everything else comes after that, that's a decision that we have all made, an interpretive decision we've made about the Bible. Not necessarily a given as the text comes passed down to us. So the first thing that comes out in the commandments are all of the rules about the tabernacle, how it should be built, how it should be furnished, how the people who enter it should be dressed, and all of that. And that's really the first important conversation that the law brings, that the Torah, that the set of instructions bring, is the focus on the tabernacle itself. But then we move into Leviticus, and now we get these more specific rules about daily behavior and dress and comportment and what you can eat and relationships and community, and it goes on, and again, highly, highly detailed. What you see in here, though, as this passage would have gone on, certain words are used to describe this, and there's this group of words that are used interchangeably. And when you read the whole of these texts, trying to make a distinction between which words are more important and which words are less, whether we're using the word unclean, or we're using the word abomination, or a defilement, or impure, a set of words that are all connected and related and are used interchangeably, and consequently to say, well, and this is one of the tricks that we get into. These verses not quite so important. Right? This verse in particular, right? We all know, refers specifically to the eating of pork, among other things, right? Also camel, by the way, but the animal, the primary animal that we will all think of when we think about divided hoofs is the pig. And pigs don't chew the cud, so they are unclean. They are an abomination. You're not allowed to eat those as you follow the biblical law. Well, so what do we do with that, right? What does it mean for us to carry this idea, to carry this commandment in our scriptures? But for most of us as Christians, yeah, that's not such a big deal. We've kind of gotten over that. Many of our Jewish brothers and sisters have gotten over that, frankly, by the way. Yet there are other verses in Leviticus that we're more willing to cling to, especially, sadly, about sex. So that's kind of why I wanted to do this tonight, is to say, well, why this and not that? What does that matter? And who made that decision and how? All right, so we get the Levitical code. We've been through the Exodus. We are now settled into the wilderness. We've done the whole Mount Sinai thing. We have 40 years of wilderness ahead of us until we get to the Promised Land. And we're going to get all of these instructions. Now, one of the things that we're going to really notice after, as we get into Exodus, is a different context around the question, who is God? Which is, after all, the primary question that we're asking of the Bible to tell us who is God and what does that mean. In Genesis, in the beginning, there's a familiarity to God, right? God with Adam and Eve in the garden, and they just kind of walk through there. They're physically present together. And even through the story of Abraham, God taking this more sort of familiar role, this more familiar relationship, God speaking directly to Abraham or sending angels to speak through them, or just God's voice speaking to Abraham, and the same with Jacob as well. But as the Genesis stories move forward, God changes. And when we get to the Exodus story, suddenly the experience of God is quite different. Now God is the God of Mount Sinai. Now God is God whom cannot be looked upon directly, that there would be danger to that. When the Israelites first approached Mount Sinai, they're only allowed to come so close to the mountain. Only the priests, only the Levites can come closer. And only Moses himself can actually go up on the mountain. And so God now has this otherness, this different quality, this magnificence, this omnipotence suddenly is much more significant as we move into Exodus and then into Leviticus. And that change in the way that God is understood, that separation now between God and the people themselves, that is part of what informs then all of this code of the covenant. All of these laws are very much about that. They're about this idea of division, of separation. And in fact, if we went farther into the book of Exodus, we would find this kind of language here. I, the Lord your God, have separated you from the peoples. You shall therefore make a distinction between the clean animal and unclean, the unclean bird and the clean. Do not bring any abomination upon yourselves by animal or bird or anything within the ground with anything with which the ground teems, which I have set apart for you to hold unclean. You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord your God, am holy, and I have separated you from other people to be mine. This notion of holiness, of purification, becomes now a significant part of, a significant theme of the people's understanding of their faith. This is a priestly term particularly. And one of the things that scholars agree on about the first 5 books of the Bible is that there are a number of editorial hands at work in the way that the text is gathered, put together, and received. You want to remember that the story of Exodus happens 1,200, 1,400 years before the birth of Christ. There is not a lot of written Hebrew language yet. And so much of the covenant, much of the Levitical code, for example, is carried orally for quite some time. And it really isn't until the Israelites arrive, they build Jerusalem, they build a temple. Suddenly they have a place to worship, and now suddenly all of their practices are going to become codified. They're going to be written down. They're going to be written down in great detail. Scholars believe that the materials in the first 5 books of the Bible come over really 4 specific times in history. The Yahweh's part, the oldest parts of the Old Testament, where God has this more familiarity to him, this God by name, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But one of those editor's hands is what we call the priestly writer. And much of the way that the covenant is coded has that priestly context to it. That is, it comes from a viewpoint in time when there's much greater focus on worship in the temple and the piety, the practices of religion and in those days. So this notion, this word divide, hivdil, appears often, especially in the book of Leviticus. And it's very much about, I talked a couple weeks ago about great themes of the Bible, this notion of some things are sacred and some things are profane. Some things are right and some things are not. Some things are clean, some things are not. And making those separations, making those divisions, that's what all of this code is about. How do the people of God separate themselves from the rest of the world? How do we distinguish who we are in faith from all of the rest of the world around us? It was an important part of Israel's identity throughout all of history, up until the time of the New Testament. And of course, that's part of the New Testament then is to see that then be turned upside down on its head, but that's a different Bible study. In the meantime, as we're reading this, we're seeing that this is the important question, is to make this distinction. And while we get caught up in details, well, that distinction is, so no more pork, no more bacon, no more sausage, no more ham. We miss out on the wider question, which is, What is particularly special about my life because of my faith? What does that call upon me? How does that call upon me to see my daily activities? So you see a couple of different things here, right? One, let me suggest a couple of other larger ways that this notion of division is used. And that will, I think, maybe put some context on it too. One is about the sanctuary itself. The sanctuary is divided into specific sorts of places. So there is the Holy of Holies, the very center of the sanctuary, in which only the priest can enter, and in fact only at certain times. And then there's a larger courtyard for men mostly, right? And then the larger that include women, children, and then it goes out in these concentric rings, depending on where you are in the faith. There's a separation there. Now, we would never think of building our churches in that fashion, although you'll notice in the architecture of most churches, right, how the chancel, how the quote pastor's area, right, is separated from the rest, usually by a railing, which is where we serve communion. I served one church where, in fact, you could not get past the railing. You had to exit the church and come in through a separate door from the sacristy to get to the altar itself. Right, so we see vestiges of those ideas, but we understand now that physical separation is not what makes that space sacred. So we understand that notion of separation or division in a much different way. The other one, of course, you see when we get into the temple ritual law is the notion of blood. Blood in the ancient covenant is understood to be something very sacred and holy, cannot be touched, should never be consumed, because the very essence of life itself was contained in the blood of the creature, whether it's human blood or animal blood. And so when an animal was prepared for sacrifice, right, it was bled, and that blood was captured and then dashed against the base of the altar, and only the priest could touch it. You see other parts of the law that really capture how sacred and holy blood is. Some of the restrictions around women are certainly because of that understanding. And again, we have a different understanding of that now, yet at the same time, that sort of begs those same sort of questions. So what is the power of this idea of dividing ourselves, of separating ourselves, of understanding that some things are sacred and some things are profane? And then, of course, how do we get to make that decision? Should we go backwards? Should we all stop and say, wait a minute, you know, it does say no pork, and be done with that? Or is there a way for us to go forward, to get past that just sort of literal question and understand these laws, these real rituals, these covenants in a much better way? And the answer is, of course there is. As we talked 2 weeks ago, if we look at this in the context of the whole of the scriptures, not as a set apart piece, we're going to see a couple of different things. So, of course, the first theme when we get into this part of the Bible is this idea that God rescues slaves. And I think it's impossible to read anything in the Pentateuch without taking into understanding this important theme. And the book of Exodus, the moment of Exodus, the moment that the Israelites come out of slavery and become a nation, that is what defines them. That is what defines their faith and their religion. Prior to that, they are simply a kin, a clan, a group of people who are related by blood. But as they come out of slavery, as they enter into the wilderness and arrive at Sinai, now they become a nation, a people. And that act is highly defining of everything that will follow. So if the point of the Bible is that God rescues the slaves, if that's a defining characteristic of faith, then taking all of these 631 commandments and making us slaves to them kind of defeats the purpose, doesn't it? Right? I mean, the giving of the law is not just simply a different kind of slavery. It cannot be a different kind of authoritarianism. And in fact, you notice when you read in Exodus chapter 20, the 10 Commandments, when we start, the very first thing that it says is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of slavery. And that act of salvation, that act of grace, is what defines everything that comes afterwards. So for us to use the commandments as ways to hold power over one another, or to create a different kind of slavery, really goes against the basic understanding of what the word is all about anyway. I mean, that's what I mean by reading a verse out of context. You cannot take an idea and say, well, if your sexual orientation is homosexual, you can't be a human being and you can't be part of the community. Defeats this entire concept, and so it has to be read in a different way. To say, well, we're going to oppress people who eat pork, is not what that law and that rule is for. Not what that idea is for. That idea of separation, of distinction, is not about oppression. It cannot be a new kind of slavery, right? Part of what's interesting is to think about giving law in the context of the ancient world. In the ancient world, the king made laws. The king gave edicts, and he just simply passed them out in his court. Here, the people are gathered together, and God's word is read to them by Moses and given to them as a whole, and never directed to an individual, right? But there's a wholeness to it as well, because it belongs to the people as a whole, and it serves the needs of the work of the people as a whole. The other theme that I wanted to catch on is God is with us. And this becomes obviously a little bit different. We understand that in a little bit different fashion as we get into the New Testament and we get into the person, Jesus himself. But one of the things that's fascinating as we read the whole of the covenant is how detailed it is. How much of it applies to just simple, basic actions, how you dress, how commerce is conducted, how government is done, land ownership, and personal practices, health practices, and again, dietary practices, and so on. Part of what that conveys to us is a reminder that our daily lives actually matter to faith, and our daily contact and the small details of our life have meaning. And one of the things, of course, that we always want to do with this particular kind of material in the Bible is we want to see it as sort of a point system, right? An accounting. I don't know if you saw the series on TV, The Good Place. That was such a great series, and it really wrestled with that question, right? That life is just this game that we play, that we accumulate points by doing good things, and here's the list of 631 good or bad things that you should or shouldn't do. But instead, to see the whole of this material as a way to enter into a conversation of how does my daily contact affect my faith? How can I grow spiritually by thinking about the things that I eat? The way I take care of myself, the way I present myself and conduct myself. One of the things, of course, that we don't do a very good job of talking about, and I think this is fascinating because we love to get very literal, especially again about books like Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. Much of the law, if not almost all of the law, carries with it this dimension of justice. Right? I mentioned this before. There are 36 different commandments in those 5 books that deal with how we treat foreigners, how we treat resident aliens, how we treat people who come, and how we treat them with justice, how we receive them into our community. People are a lot more interested in the 2 verses of Leviticus that deal with homosexuality than they are in the 36 verses that would probably say to us, hey, we should not have a wall on our border. Hey, but this is the thing. Right? As we read the whole of those books, as we really grasp the entirety of the Pentateuch, what we discover is that God is very interested in having us look at our life every day and ask those questions. How do these choices help me grow spiritually? Not earning favor with God, because of course the covenant is given to God's people after their redemption, after their deliverance. But having now been drawn into this relationship with God, how do I live it out every day in small and what seem to be insignificant ways? I think it's a challenge to us who would like to practice our faith, would like to practice our faith mostly for just 60 minutes on Sunday morning, or in just these sort of larger kind of themes. To think about the fact that everything that we do affects how we live out the grace of God and gives us an opportunity to bring that grace out into the world as well. One more of these great themes. God is bigger than we always think that he is. Right? Well, one of the things that the word really captures is the sort of both the grandness of God and the mysteriousness of God. That we are not given to try to put God in categories or put God in one small place as well. One of the things that is amazing about this material is just how much that there is. Almost incomprehensible. Certainly, I think, impossible to manage. I mean, there would be no way to try to live your life in such a way that you kept quite literally all of those commandments in just those first 5 books. Would be nearly impossible, right? The level of detail, but just also the layers of it. And this is where I think this comes in. To try to read these commandments and to just see them as sort of simple is to then pretend that God is just kind of simple. And the truth is that God is far more complex in his own self than we can possibly imagine. And consequently, so is his word. And so when God is asking us to think about what we eat, or again, how we conduct our business affairs, for example, he's inviting us to try to open ourselves up to this sort of complex mystery that is God. And instead of assigning a simple meaning to it, to let these layers of truth and new perspectives constantly inhabit the word and come through to us. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus touches on a few pieces of the Pentateuch law. What's fascinating is not that Jesus calls his listeners to interpret them literally, and not just that he tries to narrow them either or make them go away. What I'm always amazed is discovers how he makes them greater and wider. So he says, "You've heard it said that you shall love hate your enemies and love your neighbor and hate your enemies. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Or Jesus will say, "You've heard it said of old, an eye for an eye. But I say to you, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, offer them also the left." How Jesus takes these themes of the covenant law and expands them into much wider capacity than you and I could even possibly imagine. One of the things I've always loved about Luther's catechism is how he deals with the 10 Commandments. When Luther talks about the commandments, he doesn't just see them in this negative sense, but he also understands that carries with it another layer of meaning, a positive commandment. So, for example, in the 5th commandment, "You shall not kill," Luther understands that and says that in the Catechism, this means we shouldn't harm our neighbor or cause him any pain. But then he says that it also means that we should protect his life and his well-being and care for him in times of need. So it's not just simply about not committing murder. It's also about seeing to our neighbor's health and well-being. And that becomes a much more expansive understanding of the kind of material that we find in the Pentateuch. It is a fascinating part of the scriptures. It contains material, the book of Numbers, for example, these great census that's been conducted among the Israelites that actually will become important as we parcel out the promised land. Such detailed work, and as always, I think an opportunity for us to shake loose this temptation to read it just as simple, literal kinds of laws and rules to our own benefit, or that we could use against someone else, which is too often how our relationship with that text goes. But to see them in a larger sense that will give us some clues to understanding who is God and what is his will for my life, and how might I have a life that lives more deeply in his grace and in his love. With that, I'm going to take a quick peek here at the Facebook page, see if there's any questions that you have, perhaps, that you'd like me to speak to before we finish for the evening. Thank you for who are joining me right now. There probably will be some others I know, and I'll say, as I've been saying before, if later on you think of things you wanted to discuss or wanted to ask about, please feel free to reach out to me directly or put something in the comments section here and we can share it with one another. And through the week, I will try to keep an eye on that as well. With that, I will wrap things up here. At 7 o'clock, our midweek Lenten worship service will be live both on the Facebook page here and on the website as well. Tonight's service being hosted by Augustana Lutheran Church as one of our Metro Lutheran partners, and it will include Holden Evening Prayer. So I know that you all at St. Matthew enjoy that very much. With that, I will say good night, and we will see you next week.